Well, today, folks, we have a special treat. We're going to introduce you to something called the tall poppy syndrome. If you've never heard of that before, you're going to enjoy this. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you are listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I have a very special guest today. As the teaser told you, we're going to talk about something called the tall poppy syndrome. I had never heard of it before until I met my guest, and he is also a Doug. His name is Doug Garland. Doug, welcome.
Welcome. I'm happy to be here, Doug.
Yeah, we'll get that out of the way and don't have to say that again. But first, before we get into the actual title and the subject, tell us a little bit about your background. I think it's fascinating. I think listeners will really enjoy hearing your journey.
I grew up in a small farm town in Iowa. I eventually worked my way through medical school, ended up in the South studying orthopedics, and then ended in Los Angeles, California. I was associated with the University of Southern California and was a clinical professor of orthopedics, where I authored over 110 peer-reviewed scientific articles. And I also worked at a rehabilitation center, one of the premier centers in the country, where over 30 years I've worked as head of 4 various units, but the spinal cord injury unit and the head trauma unit were premier units in the entire country.
Fascinating work. And as part of that journey, as I recall your story when we were talking earlier offline, you were introduced to this thing called the tall poppy with some colleagues over in Australia, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, I had a private practice was my main focus, but the other work was just an interest. I was presently running the spinal injury service, which was 100 beds, which is a huge service for spinal cord injury. And I was president of the American Spinal Injury Association at the time, and was away at a medical meeting, actually firming up a commitment that I'd made to Australia. They have 6 major units in the entire country, and I was going to go over and visit each unit for a week and go over the programs with it. I was finalizing with my cohort in the meeting that I was at. I came back from that meeting, and there was a note on my door of my office, which was the premier office in the hospital corner with the big window. And it said that my office had been moved down the hall. I was now in a little cubbyhole. So I was actually very confused about what had happened, but my cheese had just been moved while I was gone. And I went home and told my wife, and she said, "This is perfect. They're telling you they don't want you. Take Fridays off, and I'll take Fridays off, and we'll enjoy LA." And being more emotionally alert than I was, I probably would have gotten into a pissing contest and gone back, put on the gloves and try and get my position in my office and hold on to everything. But I walked back or went into my office, put the key on the desk, threw away all my slides, all my scientific research. I had 2 great big green bins and walked out. And I called the people in Australia and told them I wasn't coming, and they wanted to know why. And I told them what had just transpired. And they said, "Oh my goodness, you've been tall poppy." So that was my introduction to the tall poppy syndrome. So I finished my private practice. And then when I retired, I had a lot of time to think. And I always had the tall poppy syndrome in the back of my mind. So I spent a year in the library doing basic research on the syndrome. And then I spent the next 5 years I took Time Magazine, LA Times, New York Times, various journals in America, because my clinical observations of the entire world were showing me that tall poppy syndrome was prevalent in almost every country in almost every time period. And why wasn't it recognized in America, or was it not even in America? Essentially, my review of all these journals every day I found incidents of tall poppy syndrome every day. So my original proposition was individualism prevented it. That might be the reason we don't have it in America, because we're such an individualistic society, and our meritocracy. So that became the premise of the book. But by the time I concluded, I felt that the tall poppy syndrome was more relevant in America than any country I studied. And I came to the conclusion it was just unknown for reasons I don't know, but it's unknown. But certainly, as the time has progressed since I began my journey, the prevalence has only continued to increase. Our so-called cancel culture, that is the premier example of the tall poppy syndrome. So they're canceling everybody, which is cutting people down, right or wrongly.
So explain for everybody the basic premise of what does it mean to be tall-poppied, as your friend told you?
So the tall poppy syndrome is a metaphor for looking at the field of poppies and seeing one poppy taller than the rest, and wanting to cut that poppy down so that all poppies are equal. That was originally described in ancient Greece, and when you think about it, Socrates himself drinking the hemlock was a case of the tall poppy syndrome. When it was described in Greece at that time, they used the heads of wheat, and throughout history, the main cutters have been governments, and governments always want to cut down the opposition. And so that's what the tall poppy syndrome was in Greece. And then in Rome, ancient Rome, it was actually described as a poppy field with the poppy getting lopped off. And you have to think no further than Julius Caesar to think about the tall poppy syndrome, because he was literally and figuratively cut down. So I found it everywhere, in all periods, in all societies. Other societies actually have names for it, and they have different metaphors. For example, Japan has the tall nail gets pounded down, and Holland has the tall tree catches all the wind. And of course, the Scandinavian countries, which are the most prominent of all egalitarianism, they have the law of Jante, Jante. These are actually 10 commandments of how not to grow tall and how to fit into a homogeneous society. So it's everywhere and unrecognized here, but it's certainly here. The real problem I had in originally thinking about the concept and making it worse, or understanding it, was most tall poppies that are cut down aren't tall poppies. And your tall poppy may not be my tall poppy. So I modified the thinking or definitions of it, and I have what I call a peer-to-peer tall poppy syndrome. That's the average individual, and that's where it's most prevalent. It begins in your family when you're born. If you have siblings, and your parents usually try to keep everybody equal, and there's intra-family fights of each sibling trying to maintain equal balance. You get into school, it's the same thing. It frequently starts as bullying and becomes more pervasive as you age out, as meritocracy becomes more involved in trying to get into college and into professional schools. Once you get into the workforce, of course, which is very germane to your audience, the tall poppy syndrome is really relevant, because as you climb the ladder of success, you're going to have to cut down a competitor. So anytime you have competition, the tall poppy syndrome is in full bloom. And then, of course, you have the workers who may not like the supervisor or the owner, boss, and of course they want to cut them down. So that is the example of the peer-to-peer. That is driven by envy. Envy is divided into two groups: good envy, which is looking at somebody and trying to emulate them, which is how I got through undergraduate school, into medical school. Residency was always studying people better than I was and trying to emulate them. Bad envy is looking at your neighbor and see he has a better car than you do, and directly you have bad envy by keying the car or punching a tire out. But indirectly, which is the most common form, is talking to your neighbors about disparaging remarks and trying to cut the person down that way.
Right.
So not only do you covet what they have, but you want to ruin their happiness as well. It's mainly noted in low self-esteem people. Then we look at the public tall poppy, which America has more tall poppies than any country in the world. That is another reason why it's so prevalent here. We have the media, we have politicians, we have Hollywood, we have CEOs. I mean, we have an abundance of tall poppies. So if envy and anger drove the emotions of the cutter, I had to figure out what the egregious actions of the tall poppy were that the cutter would want to cut them down. So by far and away, the most common problem in the tall poppy is pride. And this is also good for your listeners. Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, also wrote a book called How the Mighty Fall. And in that book, the number one cause was CEO pride, or the whole company having too much pride and thinking nobody was better. So pride was the number one reason, and greed is the number two reason, and lust is the third reason. So when you think about the tall poppy syndrome, I'll introduce you to another concept, is the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
And those, at least in Catholicism, which I grew up with, was always a negative connotation, the coveting or the pride. But actually, there's a corresponding virtue in Catholicism, but in psychology, there is a functional state. That's why I broke envy down into good and bad, because it's the same emotion, but there's two components. And Aristotle did that clear back in ancient Greece. He was the first to describe the two components in envy. So that concept has been around, but it has the 7 deadly sins because we think negatively of it. But if you just keep the 7 deadly sins in your mind, 5 of them are found in the tall poppy syndrome, and you can evaluate your family situation, your neighborhood situation, Hollywood, sports, media, politics, and you're going to see that those virtues in most of the cuttings that happen throughout the country and in your own place of business. That those will drive it all the way. And then if we can always throw in revenge, which is kind of an extension of anger. But in violence, only less than 10% of violence occurs after anger. So we associate violence with anger, but it's not that common. I mean, there's a lot of anger out there, a lot of cutting, but not necessarily violence and revenge.
Yeah. So I'm thinking really there are two major angles to explore here for someone that either already is in a leadership role or is aspiring to be a better leader. Odds are, by standing up and accepting that responsibility to be a leader, you have inadvertently declared yourself a tall poppy.
Yes.
You're allowing, even though there may not be an ounce of ego involved, but you since the opportunity, or maybe the organization has bestowed it upon you, you've been elected, promoted, moved into a position of authority. Or if you're an entrepreneur, you're striving to build your business and lead that business to higher levels of success. So you are growing as a tall poppy by doing that. So for that individual in all your studies, Doug, what can an individual do to minimize the energy that would cause those around him to want to be cutters and tear them down?
The first draft of the book, about a third of the book was how to become a tall poppy. And as I tried to figure that out, I noted that there were 10,000 books a year on how to become good at something. So there's all these self-help books out there. And then I got to thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to change somebody with my little itty bitty book when some of them are emphasizing that. So I kind of had to flip the switch, and I began to study people in a different way. And then in my book, then only one chapter was devoted to tall poppies, and all those tall poppies were servants. So none of the people were business people. None of them were in the media business. None of them were in Hollywood. It was about prominent people that were helping fellow man. So they were either helping the environment, helping fellow man, or doing something for the betterment of the world. Kind of like the stars always say, pray for world peace. But being a servant is the best way to become a tall poppy, and that translates into the business world as well. When I was chief of the spinal cord injury service, my boss, who was the CEO of the hospital, we never had a disagreement once in my 30 years that I worked for him. And he would just come down to the various units that I ran over the time. And it was always to, how are you doing? Is there anything you need from me? How can I help you? So I think that's the best message for any leader, is the way you lead is good example one, but making sure you're making a path for the others to be successful. And of course, if they're successful, you're going to be successful.
Well, it does beg the question, and I guess spotlight the leadership style or framework known as servant leadership. And I still, to this day, I run into executives from time to time when the term servant leader comes up, the hair on the back of their neck rises up and they get a little bit animated about the notion that that's a bad form, and that connotes weakness and a lot of other things. And I'm usually quick to say, well, have you really studied it? Do you really understand the dynamic of how that can play out?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And people, as you mentioned, well, I'll tell you a different way to look at it. One of the Australian studies that I reviewed was a high school study of boys and girls athletes, the best athletes in the school of the two sexes. And they were asked if they were bullied. And every girl athlete claimed she was bullied. And there was not one male that stated he was bullied. So what I took away from that was the bullying is pervasive in schools, which everybody else agrees with, I think. But the fact that women look at it way differently than men, and then men, it becomes sort of ingrained in their manhood. And you grow up, well, that's part of growing up. And CEOs, you learn from observation of your past experiences, and most of them either bullied or were bullied, and they continue that pattern into workplace, and especially as you become the CEO, as you mentioned, sometimes you just grow into the position. Shakespeare says some have it thrust upon them, like the president in fighting with Russia right now. So you don't self-reflect. You kind of have that reflex emotion and use one of the bad emotions and push back whenever somebody challenges you, instead of having self-awareness and reflecting on the situation and say, hey, wait a minute, that guy's asking for help. How can I help resolve his situation? So instead of being authoritarianism, you need to look back more for how can I best help him solve the problem? And once again, when Dan Goleman in '95 wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, which he felt emotionally control. If you were in emotional control, you had the best chance of being a good leader. And my book pretty much proved that out, or my observational research proved that out to be true as well. And that's why, even if you read the book, it is nothing about leadership, but it's more about observing the world. And as you observe the world, you self-reflect. And as you self-reflect, you figure out where you are in the world and whether you're in the positive or negative side. And the leaders frequently don't self-reflect. And then the tall-poppied syndrome shows you the emotions that are going on in themselves, and it makes them a better person without ever studying how to be a better person. So the book is kind of a negative concept, but it's negative energy. But it turns out, if you understand what's happening, it makes you a better person.
That's great. Well, you know what, Doug, we're already kind of on the halfway point here. I'm going to pause and take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to explore we're going to flip the script, and we're going to explore the energy and mindset of those that become the so-called cutters of tall poppies. So hang on, we'll be right back.
Business is all about solving complex problems as fast as you can create them. Become the best problem solver by leading others to greatness too. And the first step is going to DougThorpe.com. Doug Thorpe is known globally for coaching entrepreneurs and business leaders, improving their performance and the work output of everyone surrounding them. You can find health, wealth, and happiness by learning to lead others to health, wealth, and happiness. Go to DougThorpe.com now and order Doug's books or hire him to coach your managers. That's Doug, THORPE.com.
Hello again, everyone. We're back, and you're listening to the second half of this episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I've got Dr. Doug Garland with us. He is the author of the book about the tall poppy syndrome. We talked about the leadership side of it, leaders that either get appointed or elected or selected to take on a role of leadership, kind of inadvertently becoming the tall poppy in the field. But he also mentioned that one of the dynamics of the syndrome is that there's this force called the cutter. It's those people in the organization or in the society that want to cut down the one that has become the tall poppy. So Doug, let's talk a little bit about the mindset, emotions, and energies that go with the cutter mindset.
It's always driven by competition in the workplace, the meritocracy, and trying to move up to the next rung. And the number one emotion involved is envy, and usually bad envy, not good envy of two people. I mean, in grade school, it would be brown-nosing, two people sort of using good envy to brown-nose the teacher and bring in the apples and stuff. So that's good envy. You're trying to do something positive to it should be getting a better grade, studying harder, but there's various methods of doing it. But as it works out in society, for the most part, it's always very negative. It's bad envy and trying to undermine the other person. And I think leadership needs to be aware of that emotion as well, and not tolerate that kind of behavior. There were 6 boys in my family, a family of 7, only one sister. But I have to say, my father did enjoy a little bit of bad envy and competition, and us struggling against each other. He wanted to maintain everybody being equal, but that wasn't good. Behavior on our part, sort of encouraging that competition. I think the leadership should be aware of it, and kind of no holds barred, that it's a level playing field and everybody is working positively to get better, and that helps the company. And then, of course, anger is the same way. There is a very good side to anger. I always use a basketball metaphor, that if you're a guard and somebody drives by you, the bad anger, the next time he did that, is you're not going to let him get a layup. You're going to put your foot out and trip the guy, the opponent. But the good anger really focuses you, and it would focus you to better yourself during drills and practice your footwork so that you got better and moved over. So within the same framework of work, you should be very aware that there is good and bad anger, and just not tolerate bad anger. We can use the example of Will Smith at the Academy Awards ceremony. That was bad anger at its worst. And even worse than that, he went after revenge. And there's a good saying that if you seek revenge, dig 2 graves, because usually the person seeking revenge has to put out more energy than the other person in order to win. So they're going to lose on that situation. So it's bad enough that the competitors are doing it, but it's even worse if managers know that they're doing it and don't put a stop to it. It creates a real ill will within that particular department. And all of it can be nipped in the bud if the manager is very aware of the situation and know there's a promotion and what the staff are doing. So they need to be aware of that and monitor it and nip it in the bud. Those are the 2 main negative features within the cutter population. And it's driven mostly by self-esteem. In the society at large, it's really driven by low self-esteem. And I think we see that in our Blacks, Hispanics, and sort of the white Rust Belt, that the people have lost hope, and they don't see that they can achieve the American dream, that they don't have hope, and there's no good envy. They can't envy their way, upward comparison, and they see somebody with the home and the nice car, and they don't see their way out. And so there's nothing left for them to do but cut somebody else down. So you have to be emotionally aware of that, even in your office. You're going to have different social groups in your office, and you should understand very well the person with the low self-esteem and the mechanism they're going to use. And you don't keep them in their place, but you want to help them. You want to make sure you can get the best out of them that's possible and prevent any cutting, because trust me, once I understood the syndrome, there was tons of cutting. There's no worse. In Australia, there's almost no cutting within the professions. It's not even described in their professions. One of the first thing I did, I have published actually about 10 articles in our scientific literature of putting medicine, the tall-poppied syndrome in medicine, because people assume that, oh, well, they're a professional. They rise above all this stuff. But in fact, the professions are the worst. And when you think about attorneys, it's always one-on-one. It's always competition. It's always a duel.
Right.
So you want to be very aware once again of the concept of and be able to evaluate the situation going down a rung below you if you're a manager. And as I mentioned, my father would sometimes feed into it. You want to be sure you're not feeding into it, and if so, put a stop, but also put an end to it, and try and make everybody equal and have an equal playing field to getting the promotion. As soon as you promote somebody, and then the other members think that person didn't deserve it, well, guess what? That new manager set up for failure. They're all going to try and cut that person down, which happened frequently in our office when our doctors don't evaluate people very well. They like to take care of people and not manage offices. So it was very common for us to evaluate one of the staff, and then the other staff didn't think that was proper, and then go to undermining that person we elevated and cut them back down right in front of us.
You know, as you were talking about this, I'm tying together your story of being unceremoniously moved out of your nice corner office at the institute where you were, and I'm reminded of a chapter in my professional life. I was still in banking, and I had been a department head, and I got a call one day from my senior boss, and he actually came out to the facility where I officed, and he said, "I've got news. You're not going to be the head here anymore." And I said, "Okay, what?" And he said, "We've just made some decisions. It's time for a change." And I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And he said, "Well, you have challenged us for years on having a dedicated sales position for this line of business. Why don't you take a shot at being that guy?" I said, "What?" I wouldn't have asked for one if I thought I could do it, and but we had that discussion, and he said, "Well, think about it over the weekend and let us know, and we'll figure this out." So I went home, and I was pretty upset, and I'm going to have to admit, at that point in time in my life, I didn't have a partner with the emotional intelligence you described that your wife had, but so I sort of suffered this on my own out on my patio that night and into the next morning. But then I came to this revelation that, you know what, I'd had a good run. I had been in this leadership chain for 15 years, and I thought, if you're going to climb to the mountain, there's going to be a downside eventually. So I took that whole sales idea to heart. So I grabbed my kids and I said, "I need your help. Come with me." And we went back to the office that Saturday afternoon, and we moved all my stuff down the hall. We did the moving to a vacant office that was there, and I set up and declared that the sales office. And then reported for work on Monday, and of course everybody was confused, and the business went through its normal methodology of making the announcement and appointing the new person and all that. That of course had already been figured out. But I spent the next 3 years as a sales guy, and I negotiated a sales contract. I made more money at that bank than I'd ever made as a manager, being in a sales job. And people kind of marveled at the grace of the transition. And I had a lot of people ask me, they said, "Why didn't you get mad? Why didn't you just quit?" I said, "Well, on one hand, I kind of had the feeling that's what they wanted me to do, but they never told me why." And I said, they gave me an opportunity, and I decided to make the best of it. And through 3 years later, through another series of events and the mergers that were going on in the banking world at the time, I got a chance for an early retirement. And then at that point, I took it. But I say all that to say that I think it is important that leaders kind of gather their own emotional intelligence about what their situation may be in the moment, whether you've been cut down or whether you've been elevated to a position and you you create for yourself the correct mindset about how to administer the duties that you've got before you.
No, I agree with you. I give you an A. You're actually lucky. Lawrence Peters, who wrote the Peter Principle, which is what everybody remembers, which you rise to your highest level of incompetence, and then you don't go any further. And the banking system is one of the most hierarchical they are. And then that's why you have that tier of vice presidents. You just move them out. They can't rise any higher. And then you just move them sideways so they're not bothering anybody. But you kind of turn the tables on them. So I give you an A for that, and did have some emotional intelligence. And I just want to reinforce both Jim Collins in his emotional talents was showing the CEOs that their problem is pride. And Dan Goleman's book from '95, Emotional IQ, Emotional Intelligence, which he says emotional IQ is better than regular IQ. He's right, but it's a very hard read. I labored through that book. There's easier reads, but I think one of the takeaways of our talk today is to remember about emotional intelligence. It really, there's nothing better than emotional intelligence in a well-run office. I mean, you can look at Steve Jobs the first time, when he kind of had sociopathic personality traits, and and he was cut down. They took away his leadership role, and he went out and went through 2 other companies and kind of reinvented himself and came back and was a much better leader the second time around. Which brings me to another point: just because you get cut down, that's not, and you yourself, it's not the end of the world. If you have good self-awareness, you'll figure out what happened. Is my wife already figured it out. I don't know if I would have ever figured it out, or probably after I retired watching sunsets or something, but she figured it out right away, and that was a real shortcut for me. But you have to reflect if you do get cut down. And I'm telling you, as soon as I explain the metaphor, most people have been cut down. And so if that happens to you, it's not necessarily the cutter's fault. It might be yours. So it could be the cutter, but that's why you'd have to understand the emotions going on in both people, because you actually may be prideful or be the person that's a problem. And so if you did make that leap up the rung, it's time for a little self-awareness and try and figure out if you were the problem, and if you actually figure out you were, how you can improve yourself. And there's while we're on the emotion thing, there's one thing I did want to mention that became very apparent in the book. Jealousy is used interchangeably in our society with envy, and they're not interchangeable. Jealousy involves 3 people. So that, say you're husband, wife, and one of the 2 sees somebody else and they're trying to extract themselves from that relationship and move into the other one. So the jealous person has something that they're losing, and that's a complete opposite concept of the envy, which is somebody else has something that you're coveting. So please don't. For me, when I read that and I say, well, they're really talking about jealousy, then I already have problems understanding, who's emotion and who's zooming who and what's happening. So jealousy, envy is frequently part of the jealous complex. One of the person in there is going to be envious for sure. But the real definitions of the 2 emotions are quite distinct and quite opposite.
Well, I think people do think of that when someone is on a short list for a promotion opportunity and another peer gets picked. There is probably simultaneously an envy and a jealousy. Uh, big,
Well, they're good. They are going to lose some. Some of them, if you, as I say, it's like bringing the apple into the teacher and something. And so you think you have that relationship. You think perhaps sometimes even falsely that you have a relationship, which you may not have. And then all of a sudden the manager picks somebody else. Well, that is jealousy. So it does happen, and it is part of the cutter. But once again, if you don't appreciate the difference between the emotions, and then we have some cutting going on, it's very important to know the difference, because actually the leader could have been the problem in that whole situation. They let that relationship evolve, and then if somebody else gets the promotion,
building up the false
right,
hope and expectation that you're the next guy up.
Then jealousy is involved, and who's at fault for that? Probably the manager.
Probably the manager, yeah.
I mean, that's what the media business is all about. That's how the lust comes in. That the men happen to be leadership roles, and there's many anchors and things, and they're all working every angle in order to get that coveted position, which is the envy component of it. But they're also developing a relationship, and then they're going to lose that. So they both can be involved, but it's very important to understand the definitions, because one, as far as I'm concerned, has actively involvement of the manager and help that situation evolve, and it's part their fault, not the two competitors. So that's why it's just another example of why the syndrome is so important, because when somebody is cut down, I mean, there's the cutter has his emotions, the manager has emotions, and you, the observer, has emotions. There's other people in the office know exactly what's happened, and it's very easy for the manager to seek them out and say, what did I do wrong, or what just happened here?
One last kind of category of thought, Doug, before we close out here. I want to shift to the entrepreneurial game. What I'm thinking is it's easy to understand the dynamic of this tall poppy syndrome and the cutter activities and all that when you're thinking big business, big institution, academia, all of those. But what about in that entrepreneurial setting? You've got a founder, creator of a company. He builds it up, brings some people on board, and then all of a sudden, some of these dynamics begin to unfold. Has your work gotten into the entrepreneur plight as a tall poppy?
Well, I just from my own experience, even when I started, I worked in two groups, two different orthopedic groups. Our hospital, one of our hospitals was just a small community hospital, so I was in a very small group, and there was a father-son group. So anybody going into that situation has to realize that they're not going to be a tall poppy in a father-son owned business, for example. So right away you have to have some emotional intelligence. Now, I was working at the rehabilitation center and doing research and things. So both those two people knew that I was not going to be a threat and try and take their practice over. And so the practice worked, but we all understood who we were and what our roles were. I then joined another 8-man group, and anytime you get 8 doctors together, you're going to have problems. So we had 3 alpha males in that group, just big. I mean, they were big. I mean, in orthopedics, there's a lot of big, tall orthopedists. I'm only 5'8", so I started off very low on the rung, and we had 3 guys really running the practice, and the other 5 guys were sort of there. And we'd have a meeting, and we'd have, say, 5 votes to 3, and the 3 votes would be the alpha males. And then the next day, the implementation was the alpha male rules when they were outvoted. So yes, I experienced it, and as founders, I was never a founder, so never was in that power position, but I observed it plenty of times. And once again, I agree with, in many cases, the founder is the founder and the CEO, and he may get more money, but he also has to be a servant to the people below him, because if he doesn't have them, the practice is not going forward, and he's going to have to take more call at night. So there's plenty of abundance in any situation. You just have to figure out how to distribute it.
And I would think that in probably quite a number of entrepreneurial kind of scenarios like that, the founder is kind of, I won't call it given a pass, but it's like just an understood, they are the final voice, they are the final vote. But if the company begins to grow big enough, that founder is going to hire people beneath them to be department heads or unit heads or lines of business heads. And among those, you start getting this dynamic of who rises up in standing in the organization versus others. And I would think it would come back to your comment you made early in the discussion here, that owner or founder needs to be the one sensitive to all that. And if he starts seeing the cutting energy emerging pointed against one of those subordinates that he's elevated, then he needs to be the guy to step in and channel that differently.
Yes, I mean, once again, if you look at Jim Collins's book, that's really what he's talking about, is a prideful CEO. And, pride corrupts, right? So you'll see, I mean, in the field of medicine, before half the doctors went into the medical corporations, you would see most groups are founded by type A's, but if you have another two or three A's in there and they're not getting along, the other A's leave the office and find their own group, and then the competition really heats up, and then the original founder is now left in the dust.
Yeah.
So that's American meritocracy at its best, and that's cutting down at its best as well. But so in Australia, that would be the reason to cut that owner, the original owner, down, is his bad behavior and pride. And so they're justified in leaving and then rubbing that guy's failing practice nose in it.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you mentioned our friends in the legal profession. That's fraught with attorneys joining a firm and then getting crossways and leaving and starting another firm. It happens every day of the world.
well, I actually, one of the articles that I wrote about that I put in our medical literature was one of the great medical duels happened right there in Houston between Michael DeBakey and Cooley.
Yep.
Denton Cooley. So what we're talking about is exactly what happened in your own community, where DeBakey actually was at Tulane, where I did my orthopedic training, and then he went from Tulane to Houston. And then one of the understudies, Denton Cooley, comes along, and he was at least equal, if not better, than DeBakey. And then DeBakey actually tried to cut him down, but in the end, Denton Cooley was just a wonderful surgeon and a real talent. And Michael perhaps should have looked at things differently, but then he went across the street, and since I'm not there, I don't really understand all of it, but that's just a good example of what we're talking about. It happened in your own backyard there, and it's well documented.
And I actually have another dimension of that story. You're absolutely right in what you're saying, but I also, I was in my banking days here in Houston when all that was going on. They even started competing in the real estate market. They didn't leave it at the hospital. They started forming real estate investment groups in their name and were competing for the most prestigious property they could land for different things. And it was the classic, you're skilled and gifted surgeons and medical professionals. You know nothing about real estate. Why are you doing this?
Well, it was, I mean, both, it was just extreme pride. I mean, both of them were just prideful men, and rightly so. I mean, they were legendary and real talents, and so it happens. But it you know, when the pride gets set, I mean, I always feel, maybe not true, but Hollywood are most prideful people, and I have a saying that I act, therefore I can. So they think they can do everything, and to a certain extent, Denton and DeBakey were the same way, that they could operate, therefore they are.
Well, Doug, we're going to bring it to a close here. Thank you so much for sharing this. If anybody's wanting to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to get the book is Amazon.com.
Okay.
I do have a website with a lot of information about everything, which is Doug, D-O-U-G, and then my last name together, DOUGGARLAND.com. And then on the internet, it's DOUGARLAND@MSN.com.
Great. Well, Doug, thank you for being a guest here. We really appreciate your time. And I want to remind everybody, if you're listening this on your favorite audio feed, we do have a video version of this episode over on the YouTube channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. You can hop over there, get the video, and all of those references Doug shared is in the show notes in both places. So thank you again for joining us, and we're going to wrap this up, say goodbye. I hope to see everybody again soon. Take care.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.